Hello, my name is Roisin and welcome back to my channel. So today we are in my living room, as we occasionally are, because it is too hot. It is too hot today for me to open the curtains upstairs and let the light in. So this is the only place where you can actually see my face whilst on camera. But that does mean that there's a wash on next door, so if you do hear the sound of the washing machine, I apologise for that. Regardless, today I thought I would do another if you like this then try this book video. I did it before where I did if you like this book read this historical fiction, which I will leave in the cards above if you'd like to go and check that out. Today the kind of theme is if you like this quite popular well-known book then try this possibly slightly lesser known book that you might not have heard of. Although I do think if you watch my channel, you probably will have heard of a lot of these other ones because obviously I can only tell you about books I've actually read. But if you are new here, hopefully I will be talking about some lesser known books that you might not have heard of. And if you have been here a while and you haven't read some of these books that I've recommended before, maybe the fact that they are paired with something that you love will make the decision for you. And of course, as these videos always work, if you have read the lesser known book, but you've been put off the other book by its hype, or maybe you just have never heard of it, then obviously if you like the lesser known book, you will also like a more popular book, or at least I think you will. So that means we have 20 books to talk about today, so let's get into it. So first, if you like White Teeth by Zadie Smith for its family saga quality, its intertwining of different families through generations, its exploration of both class and race and a caste system, and its exploration of different cultures, if you like the interweaving of political and scientific discourse, then I think you will love The Old Drift by Namwali Serpell. Whereas White Teeth is set in Britain in the 70s and up until the present day, about a British man and a Bangladeshi man who fought together in the Second World War and whose families grow up together when the white British man marries a daughter of a Jamaican immigrant. And we see the trials and tribulations of their interacting families in North London, together with a middle-class white London family, and the different paths the children get drawn down. The Old Drift is a story set in Zambia that follows 100 years of Zambian history and again 3 interwoven families. We have a native Zambian family, we have a mixed race white British and Zambian family, and we have a mixed race Indian and Italian family. And whilst their families are together, whilst the great-grandfathers of the families meet in 1904, families then go their separate ways and come back together in the present and into the future. This book also interweaves science in the same way that White Teeth did by Zadie Smith, talking about HIV and the development of vaccines, but also talking about the development of technology and techno-colonialism in Africa. In the same way as Zadie Smith, it's very funny. It's got a lot of really good character studies that I think will really appeal, a lot of irony and satire. None of the characters can be taken too seriously, even if they take themselves very seriously. It also explores complicated ideas of colonialism, class, race, gender, and science, etc. through the medium of conversation, which I think is something that Zadie Smith does really well and also works perfectly in The Old Drift. It talks about a lot of serious topics and it's a thick, chunky book, but it feels like a romp and is a very quick one to get through. So I definitely think they have a lot in common. Next, if you like North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell as a piece of Victorian classic literature that explores class differences and budding political movements, then I think you will also like Odd Women by George Gissing. Now, if you like North and South for the romance, then I don't think that necessarily George Gissing will be for you, because whilst there are elements of interactions between suitors, I definitely wouldn't say it has a romantic subplot, a romantic plot that you are driving towards, but it does explore things that are in North and South, like familial relationships, like the position of women, and like class relationships as well. Although North and South does explore the working classes, they are never the main characters. And George Gissing does not talk about the working classes, and in fact a lot of his characters are quite disparaging about the working classes. But it does talk about class in a way that I have not often seen in the Victorian classics that I have read. It is about the leftover women, the women in the late 19th century who were without husbands, and the perilous situation that put women in. Whilst I wouldn't necessarily consider it to be a feminist classic, it is an interesting exploration of the lives of Victorian women and the way that class interweaves with that. It talks about lower middle class lives and people who are genteel, so not working class, but still struggle with money. It talks about some of the vices that can lead to or the difficult situations it can put women in, including unhappy or even violent relationships. And it kind of judges the way that women were only really given status through marriage. And I think that that's a really interesting exploration, and one that I think, if you like the political side of North and South, will really appeal to you. I liked North and South for its talking about the burgeoning labour movement in the 19th century, and in the same way I felt like I got a lot out of The Odd Women for its talk about some aspects of the movement towards women's rights in the 19th century. It touches on women's suffrage, but it is not the main centre of the book. It is much more about women finding equality through work. Next, if you liked the non-fiction book Pain and Prejudice by Gabrielle Jackson, I think you will like Unwell Women by Elinor Cleghorn, which I think came out last month or this month. It's very recently come out. I read my copy on NetGalley. Now, obviously, these two cover similar topics. They are about women in medicine, and while there are 2 chapters in Pain and Prejudice that are about the history of sickness and how women were treated by the medical profession in the past, pretty much all of Unwell Women is about that section. Both Gabrielle Jackson and Elinor Cleghorn are women with chronic illnesses. Gabrielle Jackson has endometriosis and Elinor Cleghorn has lupus. I felt that the history section of Pain and Prejudice was quite underdone, underwritten, and not really properly well backed up with the arguments it was talking about. And I feel like Unwell Women really fills that hole, if you felt similarly to me. It does have one chapter about Elinor Cleghorn's experience, but it is much more in-depth about the history of women in medicine, and I feel like from the 18th century up until the 1950s, those sections were my favourite, and I felt like it really did a good job of weaving together statistics and stories in a way to make it feel personable, but also feel systemic rather than just individual. I think the marketing of Unwell Women and Pain and Prejudice both do them a disservice because it makes you feel like it's going to be much more memoir focused. I feel like that's because that's a lot of what people expect from women writing non-fiction, but neither of them really are. And so I think that if you have not read either of them because you didn't want that memoir or you were uncertain, they're both much less personal than I think the copy suggests that they will be. And I personally preferred Unwell Women by Elinor Cleghorn. Next, if you liked The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr., which has definitely been one of the most hyped books in historical fiction this year, if you liked it for its representations of queer relationships in the past, its frank, moving portrait of what life as an enslaved person, its integration of religion and sort of a spiritual dimension, and its multiple perspectives and beautiful lyrical kind of baroque writing, then I think you will like The Salt Roads by Nalo Hopkinson. The Salt Roads by Nalo Hopkinson uses voodoo and Haitian spiritual beliefs as part of its story. It is set in 3 different time periods, but particularly the major time period is Haiti in the 18th century at the beginning of the slave rebellions. It is also set in the 19th century in Paris about a mixed race woman who is the mistress of Charles Baudelaire, and also in the 4th century in Egypt about an enslaved black woman who is a sex worker. So it jumps about a lot in time and is talking about slavery and enslavement and gender and race and how those things combine in the history of slavery. It is also talking a lot about the slave rebellions in Haiti in the 18th century, and uses the voodoo canon in order to explore that, with in particular one goddess who is given multiple names across time, who inhabits the bodies of these different women through different historical periods. In a similar way to The Prophets, not a linear, clear story, but that builds from seeing everything from different perspectives, and that builds together to create a panoramic view. It has a similar mystical overtone. It is similarly also a very difficult read with a lot of violence, as you would expect from a story about enslavement. But I think both are done in a very careful way, because in both there is a feeling of truth and also a feeling of hope. While there are some strong female characters in The Prophets, I think that the female characters in The Salt Roads are more powerful and more memorable for me personally. I also think both are written with a lot of religion as part of the the style of the writing, although they are different religions, because the Prophets, it's very much Christianity, and in the Salt Roads, it's this voodoo Haitian religion, and the sort of Baroque, ornate style of writing that feels at the same time quite visceral and gritty and very embodied, I think means that if you like the style of one, you will like the style of the other as well. If you like The Sympathizer by Viet Nguyen, then I think that you will like The House of Stone by Nuvuyo, Rosa, Tshuma. I didn't love The Sympathizer by Viet Nguyen because I didn't like the way that it dealt with women. There was a lot of objectification of women, and also the trope of sexual abuse of women to further a man's storyline and to further our identification with and sympathising with him, whilst completely objectifying and disembodying the woman who is involved in that situation. However, I did appreciate the satirical element of it, the feeling always on edge, and the kind of off-kilter pace where you never knew where anything was going, and also the kind of zany, but in a really menacing way, which sounds very bizarre, but I think that the way that it used satire to talk about colonialism, and to talk about American, particularly in The Sympathizers, understanding of their role in the world, explorations of like revolutionaries, and the zealousy of revolutionaries, I thought that it was a very tense book, and it did a good job of keeping that tension throughout. House of Stone similarly uses satire, uses unreliable narrators, unlikable unreliable narrators, very similarly to The Sympathizer, and that kind of off-kilter, on edge, like zany comedy, but that feels kind of scary at the same time. So The Sympathizer is a story of a man who is part of the communist revolution in Vietnam, but is a spy within the American army and ends up going to America and then working on a film that is a film about the Vietnam War, and then going back to Vietnam later in life. House of Stone is about a young man who has infiltrated this house where the son has gone missing, and he knows something about it, but he's not telling. And he's using his position in the house to try and worm his way in with the father and the mother. And through this, he gets them to tell stories about their past, through which we learn about the overthrow of the revolution for independence in Zimbabwe in the 1980s, and the rise of Robert Mugabe and the genocide that happened because of that. So both very similarly dark books that deal with conflict, and that deal with people who do terrible things but see themselves as being on the right side, on both sides, and have very dark themes and a lot of trigger warnings for sexual violence, violence in war, genocide, all that sort of thing. So they are both difficult books, and I think that the tone is really similar, but I think that House of Stone does it better, because I don't think that not every woman in House of Stone is described purely by her breasts and legs. So that is why I think it is better. So the next one is kind of a cheat, because I haven't actually finished the first really popular book that I'm going to talk about, but I feel like from the vibe, this makes sense. And that is, if you like Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi, then I recommend you read Segu by Maryse Conde. So Homegoing starts off in Ghana in the 18th century, about two sisters, one of whom ends up marrying a slave trader and staying in Ghana, and one of whom is kidnapped and taken as a slave to America. And the descendants of those two sisters, and how their lives change across time. Talking, of course, about slavery and about colonialism. Segu by Maryse Conde is actually a classic from the 1970s, I believe. Maryse Conde is from Guadeloupe, but she is writing about Segu, which was a kingdom in West Africa, in modern-day Mali. And it is about four sons of a person who is high up in this city, and the journey that they go on, and that their children also go on. So it also deals with intergenerational things. It's talking about slavery and colonialism, but it is very much focused in the 18th and 19th centuries. It doesn't go as far forward as Homegoing, I believe, does. But it has that similar intergenerational thing, if that is what you liked about Homegoing, about seeing the different paths that happened due to colonialism and enslavement. because of the 4 sons that we have in Segu, one of them is enslaved, one becomes a Muslim cleric, one stays in Segu, and one becomes a Christian. And we see the different aspects of colonialism through these 4 different boys. So if what you liked about Homegoing was the different perspectives and the travel across the world, Segu goes to Brazil and to the UK, as well as across West Africa and into North Africa. It is a real close look about 1750 to 1860, I think it's about 110 years of history. So it has the epic sweep of Homegoing, and it also has, in a similar way to Homegoing, the beginning of which anyway, a kind of distance feeling to the characters. Neither, I feel like, are great psychological character studies, but if what you are looking for is more a study of the history, a folkloric feel to the style of the writing, and a, as I said, epic exploration of a long period of history and the changes wrought in a specific place in the world, then I think that you would enjoy Segu just as much as Homegoing. Right, next, this is high praise from me. So if you liked Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel for its ability to absorb you into a historical time period, for its explorations of the machinations of court and of the psychology of people in the Tudor period, and for the darkness that permeates everything and the brilliant writing that has so many different layers, then I think you will like Tyll by Daniel Kehlmann. Tyll by Daniel Kehlmann is set in the early 17th century in Germany, so it is roughly 100 years later than Wolf Hall, and of course in Germany rather than in the UK. So it doesn't follow the same time period, but it does really truly absorb you in the 17th century in Germany, and not just in the court, although it does enter into the court as well. It also absorbs you in the lives of ordinary people, of the working classes. It may not have quite the deep psychological exploration of one person as you would get from Wolf Hall. So if what you love about Wolf Hall is feeling as if Thomas Cromwell is a real person who could walk through the door, then perhaps it wouldn't be for you. But if you like Wolf Hall and you also like books that have a touch of superstition and magic in a very dark way that you never know quite whether it's real or not, and if you like books that are non-linear, because whilst Wolf Hall does explore Cromwell's memories and his premonitions and dreams and ghosts, actually there are ghosts in Wolf Hall, so the paranormal is not entirely different between the two. But whilst the narrative is often quite linear, is more linear I would say than Tyll. Tyll jumps around all over the place to get you, which leaves you feeling a little confused, but it's kind of the point of the confusion of the 17th century. I haven't told you the plot, but it's about Tyll, who is a trickster character from German folklore who's been transported into the 30 Years' War, and he starts off as a young miller's son, as a working class boy, and then we see him in different parts of the world where he is a circus performer, a jester in the court of the Winter King, a soldier beneath a besieged city, and a man on the run through the biggest battle of the 30 Years' War. It has a similar feeling of comedy and comedy of manners almost, kind of bizarreness. If you like Gormenghast, I also think you'll like Tyll. And if you like Wolf Hall, you wouldn't necessarily like Gormenghast. But regardless, I think that the multi-layers of the writing, which is very impressive considering that Tyll has been translated from the German by Ross Benjamin, the atmosphere of darkness, the feeling that you are reading it by candlelight, even if you aren't, that I think will thrill people who love Wolf Hall. Next up, short story collections. If you like What Is Not Yours Is Not Yours by Helen Oyeyemi, for the whimsical fairy tale vibes that you get from it, from the travelling through different time periods, and for the beautiful writing and for the darkness hiding behind the whimsy, then I think you will like A Registry of My Passage Upon the Earth by Daniel Mason. A Registry of My Passage Upon the Earth is a collection of historical fictions from throughout the world, over different centuries, from one set in ancient Egypt to one set in mid-20th century Brazil. But in the same way that Helen Oyeyemi weaves a magical story around you, so does Daniel Mason in A Registry of My Passage Upon the Earth. Whilst Oyeyemi's stories are slightly interlinked and seem to all be happening in the same world, even if at different points in time, Daniel Mason's are not interlinked except through a slight, sort of subtle nod towards nature and climate change, but it does have the same sort of whimsy and some of the same mutation of fairy tale themes. For example, there is a story of a glass carriage, a story of a rent in the sky, a story of a man who is haunted by the fact that he changes into someone else, someone he can't see or know, but he knows is within him and is battling for control. So there are elements of classic stories. He also plays a lot with form in the same way that Helen Oyeyemi does. So some of these stories are Hippocrates, some mirror Gabrielle Jackson, some mirror whoever wrote Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a gothic 19th century novel. There is just a similar level of joy, whimsy and delight, particularly in the writing. I think that both have such exquisite writing that really brings a sense of joy and wonder at the craftsmanship of both of these short story collections. Next one that I'm not sure everybody will agree with me go together, but I really do think they have a similar vibe. And that is If You Like Normal People by Sally Rooney, for its exploration of the ways that the outside world and the society in which we live tangles itself into our psychology and into our relationships because of the ways that two people struggle to communicate because of that entanglement, and for a really slow moving story that centres on the psychology of a relationship. I think you will like Swimming in the Dark by Tomasz Jodorowsky. Swimming in the Dark will appeal to people who don't like normal people as well, I think. But I think that the slow-moving, really close to the psychology of these characters, really embedded in their relationship where not a lot else happens, I think that those two things really play together. The difference is, however, that the background to Normal People by Sally Rooney is the financial crisis and how that affected the Celtic Tiger in Ireland, and the background to Swimming in the Dark by Tomasz Jodorowsky has slightly higher stakes, although that is high stakes, but it is about freedom from communism in Poland and the revolution. So I do feel like this one is slightly higher stakes, but those high stakes always feel really in the background. And the foreground is the choices that we make. And it's about these two boys who met at a summer camp for university students who, in order to graduate, have to do some work in a farm. And they fall in love when being gay is illegal. And then they move back to Warsaw. And in order to survive, one joins the party and believes in the party. He really believes in the party. Whereas the other one starts to doubt the party, doesn't believe what has happened, doesn't believe that they are doing good things for Poland, and wants freedom to join in revolutionary processes, whilst his boyfriend, his secret boyfriend, is part of the party. So it explores the way that their relationship, despite the fact that they are so suited for one another, the choices that they have made and the background that they have changes the way that they view their relationship and they view the world that they are in. Because one comes from a slightly more bourgeois, urban upbringing, who has experienced firsthand one of his best friends being removed by the party, whereas the other comes from a rural background who only has the advantages he has because of the regime. And whilst it obviously is totalitarian and controlling, it also has brought people out of poverty, and the poverty of his family has been helped by the party, even though they can't be free at the same time. So it's more complex, but at the same time it has the same slow-moving vibes and the same meeting parties and people and things going wrong and miscommunication. So I think that if you like one, you will like the other. And finally, If You Like The Mercies by Kieran Millwood Hargrave, again for the incredible atmosphere, the darkness, the sense of threat for queer relationships in historical time periods, an exploration of sexism through history, then I think you will like The Confessions of Franny Langton by Sarah Collins. The Mercies is set in a small island in Finnmark in the 17th century, about witch hunts, about a community where they've lost all the men, and the women fight to survive, and also a relationship between two women. And The Confessions of Franny Langton, we know from the beginning that Franny Langton has been accused of the murder of the master and mistress of the house in which she worked as a servant, and also that she was the lover of the mistress, and has been accused of the murder of her lover as well. And we hear it's the story from her perspective in the early 19th century in London, although she grew up enslaved in Jamaica. And whilst we explore the horrors of the witch trials and sexism, in The Mercies we explore the horrors of race science and the abuses of enslaved people in both the colonies and in Britain in the early 19th century in The Confessions of Franny Langton. We also see relationships against against odds and we see the difficulties of said relationships, although I will say that the power imbalance in Rani Langton is a lot different than the Mercy's, but they both have excellent atmosphere and excellent tension, and a real at the edge of your seat, nail-biting moments while still feeling really slow-moving, really atmospheric. They both work on multiple levels for those reasons. They both draw on history, obviously being historical fiction, but also literary past, and both use a small cast of characters that we really get engaged with. They are very much like, I guess, bottle episode books, if that makes sense. Books of, because although Franny Langton is set in London, she doesn't really get a chance to leave from the house, and she doesn't get a chance to leave from the plantation when she is in Jamaica. They are both very, very dark books that have a incredibly dark atmosphere, and both will appeal to readers who love really realistic historical fiction that feels like it's very slow moving but somehow also has a strong plot. So there you go, those are the 20 books I wanted to talk to you about today. If you liked one of them, I believe you will like the other. Let me know in the comments down below if you have read any of these pairs, if you disagree with me about whether you would like them, and if you have any books yourself that you think you would pair together. If you enjoyed this video, I will leave another one here that I think you will like, and I will also leave a button here for you to subscribe if you haven't. I put out new videos 3 times a week, so I will see you again very, very soon, and I would love it if you would subscribe to make sure you know when I'm coming back. Thank you for watching, and I will see you again very, very soon. Bye bye!